So we're very glad to have you here this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, welcome back, people who are back, and welcome if you're here for the first time. Um, yeah, this is a series looking at justice very broadly across world history, looking at religion, culture, philosophy, influences on justice and legal systems. I mentioned this idea. We're trying to overcome Eurocentrism. Um, I wanted to sort of say a little bit more about that. I even use the word cure for Eurocentrism. I don't know if there is a cure. It's hard to escape our cultural background, but we can address it by learning about people from other cultures, other traditions, other parts of the world. So a lot of what this course does is try to correct or balance out a Western point of view about what law is. So we have the point of view that it comes mostly from the Judeo-Christian tradition and was influenced by the Enlightenment, Napoleonic Code, and colonial systems, etc. Whereas law and justice have a much wider background than that, and we're trying to get a sense of that. So today we move over to South Asia, or far East Asia, in other words, India and China mostly, and that's an enormous chunk to look at. So what I've discovered, I've given you 10 pages, and the first part of the first page uh, is sort of a timeline. And I've decided that I want to go through that timeline twice. Once looking at things from India, things that happened in India, developments there, and then go through the timeline again, less than a page, looking at developments in China. And then I think would be ready to sort of dance through some of the other pages, looking at major topics. And occasionally I'll just stop completely and see if you have a comment or a question or an observation or another angle on any of this. And anyway, I'm delighted that all of you are here and that we're, the Living Interfaith Sanctuary has set up this series because I think it helps build bridges between different cultural and religious perspectives, which is what the Living Interfaith Sanctuary is all about. Okay, and also many of us here are interested in social justice in many ways. And we live in a time that's quite disturbing because of the, developments in various parts of the world, like in Syria, for example, or North and South Korea, in Africa. Lots of places have different kinds of struggles having to do with justice and peace. And we're basically looking at the outline of international justice or concepts of justice going into the future. That's what this course is supposed to lead us from the past into the present, into the future. Okay, so if you look at that timeline, I mentioned things from 3500 BCE, before the Common Era, all the way up to about 1500 CE. So that's a stretch of 5,000 years looking at things in India and in China. And I pick out a few big developments that we'll look at in a little more detail, at least some of them in a little more detail. I mentioned 3500 BCE, the concept of artha, or eternal moral law, dharma as a related concept, meaning something like path or way. And then you have this figure Manu about 3000 BCE, who wrote something called the Dharma Shastra, an early draft of that, which is a large compendium of law from different perspectives. So the first two items on that timeline are from India. I'm jumping down to 1500 BCE. It mentions Krishna, the concept, Krishna's Dharma, or way, or truth, or path, as developed in the Mahabharata, which is an 18-volume story of ancient India that includes things like the Bhagavad Gita. So a lot of what we know about Krishna as an avatar, an incarnation or embodiment of the divine, comes to us through the Mahabharata. In that document, the Mahabharata, they said even kings are subject to law. So we're going to lift that up. That's an amazing discovery for Westerners to see that the concept of rule of law, that rulers are subject to law like every citizen, goes way, way back in India. I'm not saying it was always followed, I'm just saying it was taught. Then will Mahavira, the founder of the Jain faith, 520 BCE, roughly. The Buddha Dharma was developed, starting to be developed around 500 BCE. Jumping to 300 BCE, we have Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the first large Indian empire. This was after the time that Alexander went over into India. Chandragupta founded the Mauryan Empire, a very highly centralized bureaucracy. About 150 years later came Ashoka, who expanded the Mauryan Empire and was Buddhist and set up a system of religious tolerance and service to the public that really emphasized compassion and caring. And he spread Buddhism and, in effect, made Buddhism a world religion. Ashoka, one of the greatest rulers, I think, in world history. So going down, the next thing I mentioned there is in the about 50 in the Common Era, there was a figure called Vikramaditya, and to me it's fascinating. This many people would say this is purely legendary. There was no such king, but I think it's dangerous to say that legends are completely false or mythology has no basis. There was probably a figure, and that name Vikramaditya means son of valor, S-U-N, son of valor. So it means a very enlightened, compassionate king who emphasizes the flowering of the arts and the building of culture. Such a king, I believe, was the inspiration for the Gupta Empire, which formally got going around 320 in the Common Era and stretched for about 200 years and was spectacular. I've got to say a little bit more about the Gupta Empire. What made it spectacular, I believe, is that we had four rulers in a row who believed in integrating the best of the two religions that were in India at that time, mainly Hinduism and Buddhism, but also Jainism, given a lot of respect. So four rulers in a row were patrons of learning and cultivated an incredible society. A Chinese scholar visited the Gupta Empire for about 15 years. That's a very extended visit supported by the state. Fa Xian was his name, and Fa Xian was studying Buddhism in particular, but was also studying the way the whole Gupta Empire was organized and was very, very impressed. He said things like, the law code here is extremely mild, and the people almost don't seem to need law. They behave well anyway. He said things like that. And he was also saying that there seems to be no conflicts between religions. Religions sort of flow into each other like rivers. He was very impressed. So the four great kings that I didn't put in this handout, I just want to mention their names. Chandragupta, the first emperor, the founder of the Gupta dynasty, served between 320 and 330, followed by Samudragupta, who expanded the empire in size and was called a universal monarch. And then his follower, I think, was the greatest of them all, and he was also called Vikramaditya. Remember that title, it means son of valor. His name historically is Chandragupta II, but he had what he called the nine gems of advisors. They were philosophers, poets, playwrights, lexicographers, or designers of dictionaries. So it's quite a culture intensive era, the whole Gupta dynasty. And then he was followed by Kumara Gupta, who was Buddhist, but who was extremely tolerant of Hindus and Jains, and Kumaragupta developed Nalanda University, which had been around a couple of hundred years by that point, but he made it much larger. So it became a major university for Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, anyone interested in elevating themselves and culture as a whole. So there were really spectacular achievements during this Gupta Empire. And a very similar empire occurred in China a couple of hundred years later. That's called the Tang Dynasty. And I think that scholar I mentioned, Fa Xian, the Chinese scholar who visited the Gupta Empire, gets a lot of credit. He's sort of the missing link between the two great empires in India and China. And both of these empires were called Golden Ages. So if you ask someone, when was the Golden Age of India? The best answer seems to be the Gupta dynasty between about 300 and 500 in the Common Era. And if you ask the same thing about Chinese dynasties, when was the most accomplished of all of them? A lot of people would say right away the Tang dynasty between about 600 and 900 in the Common Era. The reason we're mentioning these two dynasties is that their legal system was incredible. Like this was showing, you might say, justice in its Far Eastern and South Asian forms in its highest form. So it was showing, there could be a legal and a justice system that is quite egalitarian and uplifts the multitude, solves social problems. That there was an Indian version of that and a Chinese version of that. I'm sticking now, though, with the Indian timeline going down. The last item I have in the timeline for India is 1500. The Sikh faith was founded at that time by Nanak. And the Sikh faith seemed to be a creative synthesis of the best of Hindu tradition and Islamic tradition. Muslims had started to come into India about 1,000 in the Common Era, and they became more and more influential. And by about 1550, had conquered India or were ruling India. And some of those rulers were more global minded than others. Anyway, so that's a quick outline of important developments in India. Let me do the same thing, going down the same timeline on page 1 of the 10-page handout. So at 2200 BCE, I mentioned the Chinese sage kings, and we know their names, Yao, Shun, and Yu. Now, some people will say, oh, they were only legendary and mythological. Here's why I don't believe that. Because Confucius referred to them as ideal rulers, because he said that their model was resurrected 1,000 years later under the Duke of Zhao and the early Zhao rulers. So Confucius was a well-educated Chinese figure, extremely well-educated, and he spoke of, and he was studying ethical, moral leadership and was a pretty good historian, and he spoke of the three sage kings as real and as exemplary. So I take that seriously, that they were almost prophetic figures as well as excellent rulers. Okay, then so the Sage Kings are there about 2200 to 200 BCE, for more than 4,000 years ago. Jumping to 500 BCE, so that's 1,500 years later, we have Lao Tzu, Confucius, and then soon after them, Mozi. So these three are tremendously important thinkers, visionaries of different kinds for Indian history. And Lao Tzu, we might say, he looked at justice as the way of nature, or Wu Wei, meaning creative quietude. Confucius emphasized humaneness, compassion, and benevolence, and setting up a society based on respect and specific roles that people were to occupy, with the importance of ritual and music worked into the system, along with ethical guidelines. Motsu was about 100 years later after Confucius, and he lived in this time called the Warring States. So did Confucius and Lao Tzu, for that matter. There was a long period of time, 200 or 300 years, called the period of Warring States in China, where what we would today call provinces were fighting against each other, trying to dominate one another. So those three thinkers, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Motsu, were offering wisdom on how society could attain justice and peace. So their systems are extremely important in looking at the history of Chinese thought vis-a-vis justice. Now there's another figure, 250 BCE. So this is about 250 years after Confucius, a figure named Han Fei, who's called the founder of legalism. You know, this term legalism, when you and I hear legalism, we think of someone overemphasizing law, being of a litigious nature, we might say. But legalism is a very sophisticated philosophy in Chinese history. And I tried to tune it out when I was learning about China. Like, I didn't like it. That was my first take. I don't like this, so I'm not going to study it very carefully. And I came to realize, but if you throw out legalism, you can't understand the development of Chinese thought. So here's a broad generalization. Chinese thinking about society and social order and law and justice is a combination of Confucianism on one hand and legalism on the other. So the difference is Confucius basically believed human beings are good, basically good. We need to be cultivated. We need to follow certain procedures. And Han Fei, on the other hand, said human beings are basically lazy and selfish and need to be controlled very strictly with law. The laws have to be crystal clear. They have to be well known to everybody. The punishments for violating them have to be, um, promulgated or you might say implemented right away. So there's no ambiguity. So that's legalistic thinking. It was a systematic philosophy that was a criticism of Confucianism and Taoism and Moism, and said this is what rulers should do: be the top of a very strict legal hierarchy and maintain control. So Chinese history as a whole is a dialogue, you might say, between Confucianism on one hand and legalism on the other, and combining these two outlooks in various ways. But in the middle of the first millennium of China, CE, in the Common Era of China, came this Tang dynasty, which was very influenced by Buddhism. Remember, there was that scholar Fa Xian who visited the Gupta Empire in India and noticed, wow, you can blend Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism together. He especially was studying Buddhism. So Fa Xian brought Buddhist teachings from India into China and took about a couple of 100 years for them to become integrated with Chinese thinking in general. In other words, Confucianism and Taoism especially started to integrate Buddhism. And Buddhism in its own right took different forms in China and developed. But the Tang dynasty was great, I believe, because it was a sequence of rulers that saw the value of different religious and cultural traditions and set up a society that was far more egalitarian and respectful of differences, and generated, you could say, the Silk Trade System, which was essentially trading with the rest of the known world. Silk Road is not just one road, of course, but a lot of systems moving east and west, bringing about commodity exchange as well as idea exchange. Okay, so the Tang Dynasty is an example of Chinese law and justice in one of its most well-developed forms. Okay, so looking down the timeline, I mentioned this guy Tai Tsung, who is the greatest ruler of the Tang Dynasty. Like, he's in the top maybe 10 of all rulers in human history as far as having a humane and well developed legal and justice system, and generating culture, encouraging arts and sciences and engineering, encouraging intercultural exchange, even building religious monuments for different groups so that everyone can feel welcome in Chang'an, which was the capital of the Tang Dynasty for 300 years, 600 to 900 CE in the Common Era. I mentioned in 11 on the timeline again, under Chinese points of interest, Chu Si was a Neo-Confucian thinker around 1190 and 1200. The reason I mention him is because to me he's probably the most brilliant mind in Chinese history, except for Confucius and Lao Tzu. So he synthesized Confucian thought with Buddhist thought and Taoist thought and a whole philosophy of state and the role of education in cultivating all the institutions of the empire. So I mention him as a great thinker, sort of like a Plato and Aristotle in Chinese tradition. And he was the one who, studied the classics and clarified what was most important about them, integrating them mostly with Chinese ideas. I mentioned the Mongolian code too, because that was one of the dynasties, the Mongolian dynasty in China. And the Yasa code, set up by Genghis Khan, was a very strict code, but it had one interesting quality in terms of the history of justice systems. It had a doctrine of religious freedom, so that all the many indigenous people, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Confucians, the Taoists, there were Muslims in the world at that time. There were many Christians of different kinds coming into China. So this is the most enlightened part of the Yasa Code under Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan, to allow for religious freedom. Everyone must respect the freedom of other groups. You're free to express it and free not to have religions imposed upon you. So I think that has implications for the development of international law, so I mention it. Okay, I've gone down this timeline twice, from an Indian point of view and from a Chinese point of view, and I've alighted on key figures and developments that we should now take a little bit of more careful look at. Okay, I hope that made some sense. It's overwhelming to try to condense what we know about law and justice from India and China into 10 pages, but that's what I did. And we're going to select certain things to sort of talk about a little bit more. I got to go back, though, and mention, so Eurocentrism is the name of the problem of evaluating everything through Western categories. And a related, bias is called temporocentrism. Temporocentrism is the bias that everything today, currently, is more advanced than things in the past. So a temporocentric point of view would be the ideas about justice that we have today, or law, or religion, or anything, science and art. All of them are more enlightened and more modern, or more useful and more true than what came in the past. Now, I happen to think that that's a problem. Temporocentrism is a bias. There might have been wonderful things in the past, and in fact, I've discovered a lot of them. There were times when humanity got along better in certain places than later. In other words, the moral spiritual code was operating. It had been absorbed by the populace. And so that's why I've mentioned especially the Gupta Empire and the Tang Empire, India and China, as times that were, I think, morally and spiritually ahead of where we are today. Right? They're sort of models, you might say. Okay, so temporocentrism, I think is warping reality, because some things in the past may be better than what we have today. Maybe the reason people are temporal-centric is they look at technology and they say, oh, we know so much more and we can implement science and build better tools and machines and implement and instruments than ever before. That is true, right? But we also can put them to horrible use because of a low moral code, right? We can use science and technology to make mass weapons of mass destruction or torture chambers. So I'm pointing to, looking at history as a whole as a resource. There are good models, morally, spiritually, legally, and from a justice point of view. There are good models and bad models in the past. And I would say the same thing about the present. We have good models and bad models. So this course, we're moving through history in this course, and we'll look at Western international law in one whole session. We'll look at Baha'i concepts of justice. The very last session, we'll look at contemporary forms of world order, you might say, or world law, and a justice system for humanity, looking into the future as well. So we're moving through time, picking out things that seem to be interesting or useful or inspiring or an example of something not to do. We're trying to look at those to some degree. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about India. Let me get through a few more points about India, then I'll stop entirely and see if you have comments, questions, observations. I think Nivea is here. She's been, looking at India and exploring her background and may have some comments for us. So the very first category at the bottom of page 1 and going on to page 2, I call that Ancient Indian and Hindu Concepts of Justice. And I mentioned this figure, Manu's Law. The Manu Smriti, the most influential part of the Dharma Shastra. So this is the body of ancient law that goes back 5,000 years or so in India. And it includes an amazing amount of stuff, points about the origin of law, moral codes, the development of rules and castes, the duties of women, dietary regulations, duties of kings, what we would call today civil and criminal law, domestic law. So there are pieces of that in this ancient body of literature called the Dharma Shastra. There's a distinction in all this literature, niti and nyaya. I find it fascinating. So niti is looking at detailed rules on one hand, and nyaya is looking for broad principles of jurisprudence or philosophy of law in general. So India, my goodness, looks at everything from many different points of view. There were people that looked at detailed rules and say, follow these rules, and others say, no, let's evaluate rules by broader principles that should shape rules. Okay, that's an important distinction. In the Mahabharata, that 18-volume story of ancient India, describing developments, we think, between, say, 1600 BCE to about 1400 BCE. That seems to be where it's focused. And there was there was a law, and I just want to read it. It's at the top of page 2. A king who swears to provide for and protect the people, yet fails to do so, shall be executed. In other words, kings are to follow the laws. That was the expectation. I'm not saying it was always followed and that there wasn't any corruption, but the idea of rule of law, meaning sovereigns are subject to it, goes way, way back as far as India is concerned. There were universal moral duties called yama and niyama. I give you a list of them. There was a justification for war in ancient India. And as a matter of fact, there's a justification for war or use of force in all the world's religions. If you look carefully for it. So here, for example, is something from the Bhagavad Gita. There is no greater good for a warrior than to fight in a righteous war. There is a war that opens the doors of heaven, Arjuna. So this is Krishna talking to Arjuna, his main disciple, in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, "Happy the warriors whose fate is to fight such a war, that is, a righteous war. But to forgo this fight for righteousness is to forgo duty and honor, is to fall into transgression." So, in the story of the Mahabharata, Krishna tries many times to bring about peace between warring clans. And when it finally appears to be impossible, he's telling Arjuna, a war does have to be fought. There is an evil force that we have to keep from growing. Okay, so anyway, this is a little bit of the rationale for a just war, and that has implications. There's a Buddhist version of that. There's Chinese versions of that. There's Jewish versions of that, Christian versions, Islamic versions, even Jainism, which was a very pacifistic religion, had its own version of the just war. Okay, I want to say a tiny bit more about this Gupta Empire that I mentioned in the beginning. I didn't give you many notes on it, but I just want to say a tiny bit more. One of these figures, Chandragupta II, okay, he's also called Vikramaditya, which means son of valor, S-U-N, son of valor. This was a spectacular reign. During this time, mathematics and poetry and architecture and literature really developed. There's a book called The Art of Drama, Natya Shastra, The Art of Drama, that was codified during Chandragupta II's rule. And it's an incredible book. I actually looked at this. We have something called Bollywood. And the idea of music and drama being integrated with moral and spiritual lessons, that goes way, way back. No one knows how far back. There's a concept in Hindu thought called Leela, meaning the play of God, the fact that God plays. God is a dramatist. God is a creator. God is a beautifier. God is a teacher of lessons. So all of history is full of heroes and heroines and embodiments of the divine. And we should learn from all that. We should develop dramatic stories. So drama and music and dance, very, very important part of Indian culture. The Natya Shastra, if you look at that, it describes emotions that are to be conveyed by facial expressions, bodily movements, gestures, the whole, you might say, science and art of bodies in movement and stagecraft and that sort of thing. Very well developed. You could call it the science and art of drama. This goes back to, it was put in its most developed form during Chandragupta II's rule, about 400 of the Common Era. There was a writer named Kalidasa. Kalidasa was the Shakespeare, or the Aeschylus, you might say, of ancient India, wrote incredible plays and poems that sort of integrate secular and spiritual moral outlooks, would have, incredible poetry built into them. So you see what I'm saying, that culture exploded during the Gupta Empire because you had four rulers back to back who were all patrons of learning. The greatest of these was this Chandragupta II, who was also called Vikramaditya, almost a title that was applied to other kings in other parts of Indian history. It means son of valor, capital S-U-N. Okay, and I have to mention one more thing. One of the world's most important mathematicians came out of the Gupta Empire, Aryabhata, because it was a culture that emphasized learning. So he developed what we would today call trigonometry, and the the heliocentric concept of the universe. Although he did have some respect for the geocentric, he seemed to know about Greek ideas of astronomy. But he discovered the zero, and the zero was a logjam in mathematical systems. So negative integers, positive integers opened up the possibility of algebra and higher math. We sometimes give the Muslims credit for algebra, but they got it from Aryabhata. They built on the system of Aryabhata when they went to India. They absorbed some of the knowledge of Aryabhata and his successor, Brahmagupta, who even systematized what Aryabhata said made it more usable, you might say, or more widely applicable. Okay, I hope I'm giving you a view of the Gupta Empire that would be correspond to the one of Fa Xian, that Chinese visitor who stayed there 15 years and was incredibly impressed with the religion, the politics, the philosophy, the morality, the social structure of the Gupta Empire. And he told China about that. And I think that led to the Tang dynasty in China, which we'll describe a little bit later. Okay, what else do I want to tell you about? I'm going to continue with India a little bit longer. I'm mentioning Jainism and Buddhism, then I'll stop. Okay, so at the bottom of page 2, I have Jain concepts of justice. The founder of Jainism was Mahavira. He was a contemporary of Buddha, so he goes back about 2,500 years. And they lived in a similar part, north central India. Mahavira's basic doctrine was nonviolence. That is, to purify ourselves spiritually, we need to completely overcome anger and violence. So Jainism, and we know a little bit about Jainism through Gandhi. Gandhi's mother was a Jain, and it's a very strong teaching about nonviolence as a spiritual tool, you might say, of purification. Also, Jainism has this concept of the many-sidedness of reality. In fact, you know the story of the blind men and the elephant symbolizing reality. It's been argued by scholars, is that a Buddhist story or is it a Jain story? It came up, it's both. Both Jains and Buddhists use that story to emphasize we shouldn't argue about truth. We should listen to people who are investigating it. So all of us, in effect, are blind men. And the elephant, you could say, is truth itself, or it's beauty, or it's justice. It's some large thing we're trying to understand, and we need to look at our own views as provisional and try to learn from others. What a powerful idea. So that was in Jainism too. And so Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism were all equally flowing and respected under Gupta rule for about 200 years. That's quite unusual. That explains, I think, some of their achievements. Okay, so bottom of page 2, I start with a little bit of comment on Jainism. Then on 1/3 of the way down on page 3, I mentioned Buddhist concepts of justice and compassionate society. So Buddha taught, of course, the Eightfold Path. I want to draw your attention. So halfway down on page 3, I mentioned in bold 2 parts of the Eightfold Path. Right conduct. And right conduct was broken down into specifics. No killing, no stealing, no lying, no sexual misconduct, and no substance abuse. That was called right conduct, the 4th of the Eightfold Path. And then right after it, right livelihood. You should engage in life-promoting trades. So in other words, you shouldn't be a gun maker, and you shouldn't be a butcher, right? So Buddhism sort of emphasized vegetarianism, but not in a strict way, right? But it said in terms of your life, what you should make money in a sense, being of service and promoting things that are useful and helpful and even healthy in society. So Buddhism had implications for legal systems. And to me, the biggest evidence of that is that a Buddhist king, Ashoka, who had been a military man, but was converted rather dramatically, like Paul on the road to Damascus, he was converted to Buddhism and set up a truly Buddhist society. Ashoka, in around 250 BCE, before the Common Era, served about 40 years and set up Dharma officers that went around looking and studying social conditions, making recommendations for how problems could be solved, and then bringing that back to Ashoka, who then set up a system for implementing all these suggestions. It was quite an amazing achievement. You could call this a welfare society or a compassionate society. He promoted Buddhism, but he tolerated Hinduism and Jainism, which were also there. And he spread Buddhism to Sri Lanka and to what we would call Southeast Asia. He made Buddhism a world religion worth sharing. And it traveled across on the Silk Road system, all across Asia to Korea and Japan. We owe the spread of Buddhism a lot to Ashoka, this great ancient Indian emperor who integrated Buddhism and made it a world religion. Okay, I mentioned at the bottom of page 3 some of the teachings of Buddhism. I just want to read them under fairness or justice. Treat not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful, said the Buddha. The whole land dwells in happiness if the ruler lives aright, said the Buddha. Throughout your kingdom, let no wrongdoing prevail, and whosoever in your kingdom is poor, let to him let wealth be given. So these are some of the sayings of the Buddha that were actually implemented by Ashoka. Ashoka is to Buddhism what you might say Constantine is to Christianity, an emperor who implemented a religion and enabled it to become a world religion and to spread and to influence legal and justice systems. Okay. I mentioned Buddha, Ashoka, his ethics on page 4 near the top. To me, the most exciting thing about him was that he was religiously tolerant and he emphasized service. Compassionate service is the essence of what law should be about. So I listed he had this thing called rock edicts. He would have chiseled into rock certain principles. And here's one of them, 1/3 of the way down on page 4. Commit few sins and many good deeds of kindness, liberality, truthfulness, and purity. I am not satisfied with fulfilling the obligations of the state, for I reckon my work to be for the welfare of the whole world. Wow, imagine that chiseled onto pillars that you see in various big cities in ancient India. Okay, so Buddhism became what's called the light of Asia. Buddhism, in a sense, rescued a declining Hinduism. That's one thing it did. It reformed Hinduism. It spread into Southeast Asia and all across China into Korea and Japan. So Buddhism is called the light of Asia, living peacefully with other moral and legal systems that were there. It didn't try to replace them so much as to enhance them. Okay, now I think I'll stop there. That's a quick introduction to India's, contributions to what we think of as law and justice. Any comments, questions, observations that people want to make? Yeah. Well, there's Donna. Hello, Donna.
My
Donna tried to come.
goodness.
you tried to come to this class last Saturday, didn't you?
Yes, but
But
I'm here today as well.
yeah,
I
yeah.
have so many questions, but I'll try to just not take up too much of everybody's time. All of this, it seems to me, has to do, in terms of the concept of justice, there's two wings to it, as you've outlined in my mind, which is justice coming out of religion and justice coming out of governance. In other words, a kind of spiritual branch and a secular branch in any and all of the various religions. So I'm sort of wondering a couple of things. Has it always been that we human beings walking around this planet, this earth, are trying basically to get along, trying basically to, live good lives, whether we're cavemen or we're 21st century, right? And these two things, because we think and we have a sense of something beyond this little time on earth, we get these two branches coming, depending on which part of the planet we live on. Um, I'm sort of wondering, in your huge overview of all of this, is it always this interplay? That's one
Yeah.
one area of questioning. And then the other one has to do with what you were talking about, Eurocentrism and temporal centrism. And when you were talking about temporal centrism, um, so many times you've pointed out how things, like in certain dynasties, it was a golden age. It was, and the principles upon which they worked, lived together, were so good and so positive. I wonder what your view is. Is there any possibility of revival of what's the best in the past? Because we learn and we're interested about the past on one level in hopes that we can be good, be better than what we're doing now, right? So I was wondering about your thoughts about whether or not something of the best of the past is revivable, or do we
No,
have to learn all over again?
Donna, thank you so much. What astute, observations and questions you're asking. This course is based on the hope that yes, we can learn from the past, and there is renewal. It seems to me that's I wrote a book on world history. Here's the cover of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Eye to the ages, right? And basically, this says, humanity is given guidance, moral, spiritual guidance at intervals, and then we do the best we can with it. And uh, at certain points, higher civilizations are generated. Corruption sets in, and we start to trail down. Then guidance comes again, and the story begins again in a slightly different context, in a different place, with or without awareness of the previous lessons, you might say. So yes, I think this is going to happen again. But anyway, stay tuned for the rest of the course. We're moving through history with these sections, and I'd like to show we have enormous opportunity today. On the other hand, it's one of the most corrupt times ever,
I was
right?
just going to say,
So
yes.
okay, it's a mixture. Now, this other thing you talked about, religion and secularity, or you could call it church and state, right?
Yes.
You could also call it church and that's a theme in describing all the great civilizations. Like say a pharaoh. So a pharaoh sometimes it was viewed as a god, but also a secular leader, right? So it's sort of like church and state all in one figure. Sometimes it's separated a little bit more. You have the king, then you have the high priest, right? But here's another way to put it more generically. You have a vertical dimension, which means humanity's relationship to higher reality, however we conceive it, and a horizontal. We have relationships with each other, right? With society as a whole, or with our religious group or our cultural group. So religion and has addressed both of those, and the secular world tries to address both of them to some degree too, right? So anyway, those are two. Yeah, you're right to notice that. That's what I'm sort of trying to summarize. The quest for justice is a combination of it's a moral spiritual task on one hand, and it's a secular civic task on the other. And sometimes those are closely related, and sometimes one takes over to the exclusion of the other. You know, in much of modern Western history, you might say it's the story of the weakening of religion and the strengthening of the state, right? You could say that. And you could say today the state is very strong and religion is very weak. I don't think that's an incorrect description, although you cannot kill spirituality and religion. It's built into human nature. Anyway, those are just some ruminations on what you're pointing to. Donna, yeah.
Just one little comment about what you just said, though, is if we are weaker on the spiritual and stronger on the secular, we're in bad shape. I mean, that if that's a fact,
I agree with you.
And we look at the world, we're not doing very well right now.
Yeah, that's right. But there is new light in the world. Maybe it hasn't been discovered yet, right? So, in other words, see, Baha'is say that there's a whole new religion, but other people who are religious say, you know, religion can be renewed. There's renewal movements within religion. You know, Christian renewal, Jewish renewal, Islamic renewal. You can find it. There are people who are taking the best of their religious tradition and integrating it with gems of enlightenment they find elsewhere. You see, that to me is an important theme. Kings that do that really bring about improvement. They say, well, my religion is, let's say, Confucianism, but I think there's value in Taoism and Buddhism, and other people from other cultures are also welcome here. That's what Tai Tsung said, the founder of the Tang Dynasty. Yeah, please.
One final problem. I promise I'll shut up. But the problem today, though, is we also have nuclear energy, the nuclear aspect of things, and we have the technological internet aspect of things, which in all of the studies and all of the previous, all of the things you're sharing and we're learning, that wasn't the override, and that's the override today.
That's right. In other words, the stakes are higher. You know, session 6 of this course, session 6 is, I'm going to try to follow the rise of international law from the Western perspective. So that's a 400-year story. What does that mean, international law? It has a lot to do with wars, rules about war, rules about international relationship, rules about trade, right? Rules about certain territories, like who do the seas belong to?
Yes.
Who does space belong to? Now we have things like AI, and we have technologies that could take over and be run amok, or put to horribly evil use, or incredibly good use. So anyway, the stakes get higher and higher. I want to keep what we're doing though. Like, okay, so we're on India and China, but we're moving through history, right, at the same time, and we're trying to pick out lessons or models. Back to what you were saying earlier, Donna, about legalism. So Han Fei said, we're in a warring states. Okay, so this ended the warring states. You know how that period ended? One state won. Chang Shi Wang Di won. He conquered the other 8 states, and he loved legalism. He burned all the books of Confucianism and Taoism, and he said, this is the truth, legalism, right? We're going to implement this. We're going to make clear rules, right? So we're going to set up administrative procedures. We're going to build a wall separating us from barbarians. So China is named after Qin Shi Huangdi. That's why we call it China. It was just a part of the world where there were 8 or 9 groups that didn't quite get along for a while. They were, to some degree, integrated during the Sage Kings 4,000 years ago, and then under the Duke of Chow and the Chow leaders, and then Confucius started to long for the good old days, right? We want to be in peace. We want to have an overarching justice system and an overarching educational system. But legalism, so I've discovered you can't understand the Chinese history without looking at legalism and Confucianism in dialogue. They're just, it's a big dialogue and debate, and they were combined in different ways. And different rulers leaned one way or the other. You know, Tiananmen Square, that's legalism. That's like saying, you know what? We have chaos here, and we're absolutely going to snuff it out. If we have to kill 2,000 people, we're going to do it because we can't have a Chinese civil war.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't understand that Tiananmen Square. And now I'm starting to understand it now that I understand legalistic thinking and its influence on Chinese thought through the ages. Of course, China, it ends up, I find this fascinating about China, it integrates things rather than throwing them away. So it has kept Taoism, Confucianism, Moism, which is, we'll look at that later, and legalism. It integrates that with communism, which is a type of socialism. Oh my goodness. And there are traditions of hard work and material success in Chinese history as well, right? So you have to throw that in, another layer that's integrated in Chinese history. Okay, friends, any other comments, questions about what we did so far? Looked at India as an example, along with China. Important examples and developments in the history of our thinking about justice, our meaning humanities as a whole.
Oops,
Please, yeah.
Baxter's had his hand up for quite a while.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. Please, you're Baxter. Sorry. Sorry.
Thank you, Harold. No, it wasn't too long. A question, a bit convoluted. I'm thinking just because it's old doesn't mean it's better. Although there are things to be learned from the past, but going back to the past is not a good thing. I mean, the only way forward, the only way to advancement is to go through exploration, and that means failure in efforts. Now, here's my question, which follows that. Do you see, from your perspective as a student of history, do you see a common influence on all these golden ages, which brings them to a halt? I mean, if a thing was truly golden, if a thing was truly ideal, it would never disappear. So obviously, there's some weakness in these
What
golden
happens
eras.
to us when? Oh, Baxter, you know, one of my courses is called Spiritual Renaissances. So here's a quick answer to why these renaissances, or 200 or 300 year periods, why did they come to an end? Let's look at the one in India. That came to an end because there was a group called the White Huns or the Rajputs who kept attacking them. It also those four kings, the ones who followed them were not quite as enlightened. Not quite, you know, they didn't emphasize learning to quite the degree. They didn't unite the empire as well as the other four did. So what I'm saying is, you know, you find internal corruption and external threat. In fact, that's what Toynbee pointed out. Why do these great civilizations in their apex, why do they, you know, get threatened internally and externally? So that's the quick answer. You know, to put it in terms of moral things, you say virtues get weaker and vices get stronger. That's the internal thing going on. And that also means you could say the army gets weaker, or you lose your attention, you know, to protecting the people. You're more vulnerable to. Also, the greater you get, that means more and more people are watching you from the outside. A fantastic example of that is, you know, China had all these great dynasties. Well, the Mongols were watching them for centuries and centuries, and finally took them over. You know, the Mongols were wandering hordes, right? That started to develop military expertise. They finally took over. So Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan formed a dynasty, overtaking China and creating the largest piece of real estate ever united. So internal and external threats is a short answer to what I think you're getting at, why it doesn't last forever. And then it comes again when you have either new light in the world, or you have rulers who especially integrate the old light and the new light. The old light and the new light. I kind of agree with you. We can't go back, but we can also learn from the past. We can. It helps to look, say, at the development of science to appreciate current science, right? It helps to look at the development of justice ideas to figure out where we are today with justice and where we might go in the future. It's a developmental process. Okay. Other comments, questions, complaints? Sorry, who else did I miss? Anyone hand go up? There's one, Nivi. I knew we would smoke you out eventually. Okay. Nivi.
Well, I wanted to preface my comments by saying that because I grew up here since the age of 4, I didn't have the benefit of learning the history of my native country
India.
From an Indian perspective. I can only draw upon what's recorded in the Western world. And sometimes my dad tried to tell us, but we weren't really interested at the time. And now I'm interested, but he's 90 and it's a bit taxing for to ask him now. So I have a few things to say, but I have been collecting references on various concepts that you've brought up. I'm relying a lot on a current yoga guru named Sadhguru, who has started a revival of Santana Dharma, which is the Indian word for, it's the Indian word for philosophical thought of India, which the term Hinduism came from the West because they described the people who lived on the Indus River. So there's a few things. I've been collecting the references and I'll send them to Rachel, and then maybe they could be distributed to the group because there's so many things. And when you cover 5,000 years of history in just, half an hour to 45 minutes, it's hard to comment on all of it. But a couple of interesting things. You started with Manu's law. So most Hindus would also acknowledge that that was the root of Indian philosophy. But one interesting thing about that is that the Indian word for Manu means the first man. And I want to put it to you that that word, first man, very similar to what the Western world calls Adam. So, and in your book, Harold, I found it really wonderful and very clarifying that you said that Adam is not the first physical man, he's the first spiritual man. And this concept is very similar to what Hindus believe that from Manu's law. Manu would be like the first spiritual man who codified and a lot of spiritual thinking and tried to bring sense of justice and order and harmonious living in his teachings. So that was the first thing. Since that's what you started with, that's the first thing I want to share. And then Dharma, I think the way that you described it was it's the way. So I'm going to forward you to Sadhguru's video on what an explanation of Dharma, because it's being used a lot these days, even in the West, but not fully understood. So I'll just give you a little bit what I grew up with. Dharma is that it's a sense of duty, and this is a duty to God, not to any human being, but to God. There was always a search for divine civilization. And I think that all of the religious traditions, when they are waiting for their Messiah, they're waiting for a return of the golden age, or the beginning of a golden age, the highest evolution of humanity, when we will be spiritual beings walking on this world and not so much caught up in the material world. So duty is that dharma, to what I was brought up with, is that dharma is duty to God. All of the laws, the ways that we live, are the ways that we bring about harmony, not just for ourselves, but for an entire family, for our entire society. So you don't like doing something, it's like the beginning of law. You do it because you know it's going to have good consequences. You might not like it for your own personal pleasure, but you do it anyway because it's your duty to God, to, on this earth as a spiritual being, to bring greater good to everybody. So Sadhguru explains it much better. So I'll let him talk about that. So one thing that you mentioned was this, the 4 rulers of the Gupta dynasty that caused a lot